So this is my advertising and the law presentation. It's going to go over many implications of advertisement and the ethical impacts of what happens in advertisement and how it has really changed since it started here in America and now how it is in modern times. And this presentation was made by yours truly, Brandon Breton. So this presentation will start off where advertising is right now in present times, and then it will go over what makes an ad both successful and ethical. And then we'll go over a brief history of advertisement, of the development and ethical implications, along with the controversies of interpretation of the First Amendment because of advertising, because that's where a large part of ethical impacts and just how it would be interpreted and how it be considered lawful or unlawful. After that, this presentation will discuss why ethics are incredibly controversial in advertisements and why it is also more or less impossible for ads to be entirely ethical, especially in today's times. The presentation will conclude by looking at a prime example of false advertising and the repercussions of acting unethically in advertisement. So, advertisement regulations and law are all governed by the FTC, which stands for the Federal Trade Commission. The laws set forth by the FTC are made in mind for making advertisements as fair and truthful as they possibly can be. Advertisement law has been a growing field for a long time, especially because of our surgence in technology and media and forms of being able to advertise. This is mainly due to the increasing degree to which our economy relies on advertising to encourage and promote spending. Many lawyers take up careers in advertising, especially with advertisement becoming a very large part of law over the last few decades because of its increasing controversy. And so now I'll go over what makes successful and ethical advertisement. Now, for these rules, I used a book called Confessions of an Advertising Man by David Ogilvy. And this goes over 5 main laws, not in terms of what is lawful and unlawful, but in terms of laws that make a good and ethical advertisement that's also successful. Now, for law number 1, the consumer is not a moron, she is your wife. Now, this is considered kind of sexist in today's times, but basically the interpretation is customers are more cunning than most of the world thinks. So lying to them is usually a risky and unworthy venture, and it can lead to really bad backfiring. Now for law 2. Don't bunt, aim out of the ballpark. Aim for the company of immortals. In other words, playing it safe does not cut it for advertising. Bold advertisements end up being the most successful and the most memorable. For law 3, a good advertisement is one that sells the product without drawing attention to itself. In other words, focusing too hard on pushing the product itself in an advertisement can kind of ruin the advertisement itself because people don't really like it when an advertisement focuses too much on itself. In other words, the best advertisements out there are the ones that you remember for the advertisement being either creative or unique or cunning in any way, without it constantly pushing whatever that product is. A subtle push of the product within an advertisement is generally the most successful way. So for law 4, advertisements should not be regarded as entertainment or an art form, but as a medium of information. In other words, advertisement has a much higher chance of being successful when they can advertise in a place where people are either focused primarily on a different task or they're in a generally good mood. So places that are really busy, like subways, or places like, of course, how you see a lot of these days on TV or on the internet, are good places because they're high-moving, high-traffic areas where people get quick glances at them. And then law number 5. What you say is more important than how you say it. Now, this is by far the most controversial statement because many people would argue that in advertisement, how you say it might or would be more important than what you say. Now, when he says this, he doesn't mean to downgrade how you say things, because it is still very important. However, it is also true that what you say is probably slightly more important, because it is what you're actually trying to get across and what's actually going to get interpreted in terms of what gets communicated to other people. Now we're going to go over a brief timeline on the developments of advertising in America. Now, there is way more events that happened than what I have here on the presentation, but in terms of just keeping the presentation moving, I kind of condensed it and tried to get the most important things, starting with just stuff that happened here in America. So in 1704, the first American newspaper ad happened, and this was for an oyster long wide estate that was up for sale. And then here in 1729, the Pennsylvania Gazette introduced advertisement pages in its newspaper. So this is the first time that we start seeing an actual advertisement page inside of newspapers. And then the first daily newspaper chain was introduced also in Pennsylvania. Now, a lot of the major points in advertisement, especially for newspapers, took place in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. So up until this point, there was only weekly newspapers, but now we're starting to see successful daily newspaper chains. Then we move up to 1843, where Volney Palmer opens the first advertising agency in Philadelphia. Now this is a big deal because this really starts to mean extra funding and extra effort and time putting into making advertisements. And then in 1887, the American Newspaper Publishers Association was formed. So this really made sure that there was a lot more regulation going into our newspapers as well. And then it continues over here. And so in 1906, the Congress passes the Pure Food and Drug Act. Now, this is a really big deal for advertising because it requires that any food, chemicals, any kind of product must list all of its active ingredients on the package. So everything that was put and made into the product must be listed by law now. And then in 1914, the Federal Trade Commission Act is passed, and it also named Joseph E. Davies as the first chairman of the FTC. So 1914 is the actual first year that the Federal Trade Commission is formed, and we still see it today in terms of it being in charge of regulations for advertisement. And then we move up to 1942, where the War Advertising Council is formed to manage voluntary ad campaigns